Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. Polaroid man. I didn't understand the object Freddy shook in my face or why he was so excited. Halloween night in 1987 wasn't as illuminated as today. "It's a picture," he yelled and spat into my face. "Look, look!" I put my pillowcase down and held his wrist gently to see the fuss. A Polaroid picture with Freddy in his sad pirate costume. When I looked more closely, however, I saw the singed boy beneath. Polaroid Freddy looked burnt to a crisp, his skin gone. The eyes melted away. Freddy snapped the picture from my fingers. "Isn't it cool?" He studied it again. "Like a magic trick. Best Halloween ever, right? It's cool, right?" He continued to bully me for validation, as 10-year-old boys do, until I relented. "It's cool, Freddy. Where did you get it?" "You know Mr. Malcolm's house? Super green lawn guy? Tells dirty jokes to us at the bus stop? The weirdo pervert? That guy?" Freddy nodded enthusiastically, missing my intended sarcasm. Everyone usually avoided Mr. Malcolm's house on Halloween and every other day. The man constantly invited kids inside for candy and conversation. I don't know if anyone accepted that offer. I hope not. "Yeah," Freddy confirmed. "But there's a young guy on the porch. Probably his nephew or something. He's got on a mega spooky demon mask and he's got a camera and he takes your picture and it prints out all freaky like mine and..." "Whoa, Freddy," I said. He was getting overexcited. Freddy had something wrong with him. A weak heart maybe, though I can't recall exactly what we were told other than he could die should he get too worked up. Our teachers told us to look out for Freddy, so I did. "It's great, calm down." I started breathing with him and held his hand. He smiled. "Thanks, man. Want to see?" I smiled back. "Yup." The photo had creeped me out, but also fascinated me. I didn't want to be the only kid who missed out on something cool. Judging by the line extending down the walkway, bending at a right angle onto the sidewalk, it seemed I might. There had to be 50 kids waiting for their photo. Polaroid pictures aren't fast. They don't present an image until at least 10 minutes have gone by. The guy on the porch wore a thin mask with horns that really seemed to grow from his forehead. A mouthpiece displayed jagged teeth. He carefully placed the undeveloped photo on a shoe rack at his side. You don't shake Polaroid pictures. You wait. And so we waited. He could have simply given the white rectangles to the eager kids before the image showed, but he didn't. Instead, after taking a trick-or-treater's photo, he sat cross-legged on Mr. Malcolm's concrete slab of a porch and stared at the child. Some kids tried to talk with him. He didn't answer. Others waited in silence, bearing the stranger's gaze with admirable defiance. One little boy began to cry. His parents ushered him away before he could collect his photo. I remember thinking how fortunate I was that my parents let me trick-or-treat on my own. I would get my photo. I would endure the awkwardness of the adult gaze. Time ticked on. It was late. Some kids gave up and left the line to my delight. Freddy yawned and said he had to go. I thanked him for telling me about the Polaroid man. I probably wouldn't have come down Ferry Street otherwise. Mr. Malcolm creeped me out too much. Luckily, a few other school friends were revealed by the departures. May DeFranco and Vicky Rand. They'd already gotten their photos but hung around because May's little sister wanted one too. "Can I see?" I asked, pointing at the photos. They were grotesque, and I could hardly bear it. May's body appeared popped open, entrails spilling from her guts and onto splintered remnants of bone and muscle. Only the pink princess dress she wore as her costume identified her as the corpse in the photo. Vicky's was far worse. Her dead body had been tied at the wrists and ankles. Her pale face appeared stunned at the mutilation of her body. The top half had been pulled apart from the bottom, and there were more tortured dead around her in a dark field. "Cool, right?" Vicky said. "It's like Freddy Krueger or something." "You've never seen Freddy Krueger," May said. I hadn't seen A Nightmare on Elm Street either. I never have. At the time, I assumed the contents of the photo were typical horror movie stuff. I wasn't ready for it, but I wouldn't let my discomfort show. After May's sister got her photo, more kids thought better of risking their worried parents' wrath. They left, and after one more boy got his photo, my turn came at 11:42 p.m. My parents were probably pissed off by 8, so I figured wrongly I wouldn't be in more trouble for continuing to stay out way past the time I should have been home. Though I did have second thoughts, especially when I realized no other kids remained. I would be the last, and I was alone with the devil masked man. "Don't smile," he growled. I adjusted my face quickly to obey. He snapped the picture and sat on the stoop. We waited. The last leaves on the trees hissed a warning in the wind. Their dead brethren skittered away down Ferry Street. I could hardly breathe as he stared. There were no visible eyes in the sockets of his mask, only oily voids, an unfortunate trick of the dim porch bulb. It had to be. The feeling in my stomach called for a quick escape. "I think I need to go," I told him. His hand gripped my wrist hard. I squirmed. "It's okay. I can pick it up tomorrow." He did not let go. His face, that mask, got close to mine. He was perfectly quiet. No inhalation or exhale as he forced me to stay put. "Please," I begged. "I want to go home." In the half-inch space between our noses, he slid the developing Polaroid. This close, I could barely see anything. Then the devil's mask appeared in the photo. Then I, or what would become of me, materialized. The Polaroid featured us together, his hands around my neck, my face empty of life. I yelped and pulled away. He let go, and I fell onto the walkway. He stood up and tossed the photo with precision. It landed beside me on the grass. Further details of the horror were revealed. A swath of blood matted my hair and soaked the front of my costume like a gory bib. The man in the devil mask had done more than strangle me according to the image. I backed away, a reverse crab walk of cumbersome doom. He hadn't moved because he could catch me anytime he liked. His first step knocked his camera off the stoop. It clattered, and a piece shot away from the impact. He didn't seem to care. "P, please," I pleaded with him. I don't remember the specifics of how I got up and ran down the middle of Ferry Street. I only recall the chase was brief because I made a mistake and got cornered in the variety store parking lot. The store, Brothers Variety, had been closed for hours. There'd be no help there. The streets were empty. Most people were asleep. How I knew this or thought about it in such a terrible moment came down to dumb luck. I backed into a pile of leaves bunched up with fake spider webs that had blown off someone's house. Stuck, I raised my arms defensively and caught the time on my digital watch. The wrong side of midnight by 12 minutes. His fingers caressed the sides of my neck. I closed my eyes and started trembling uncontrollably. Pain would be next. Great pain, the photo promised, and death. "No!" I tried to shout, but it came out like a squeak. "Halloween is over. It's over. It's done. You can't." I don't know what I was saying or why, but the fingers retreated and he took noiseless steps backwards over the cracked tarmac. When he reached the sidewalk, he spoke. "See you next year then." As if it had been a prank all along, he walked away casually. It took far too long for me to go the opposite way. Eventually, I managed a slow jog, working through the blocks to home, where my mom waited in the front window, worried and angry. Punishment was left up to my father. When he returned from searching for me, I told him about the photo and the guy in the mask. He received the information passively before grabbing his baseball bat and calling his brothers. Together, they went to Mr. Malcolm's and discovered the busted door in the backyard. The old man had died in his chair, completely naked. My dad told me this last detail some years later. Police were called, but nothing came of whatever investigation might have followed. My parents had, and have, no faith in the Bridal Veil Lake PD, hence the reason he called his brothers and picked up his bat that night. Evidence of the devil-masked man existed, of course. Many kids had their photos taken. No police or adults asked about it, as far as I know. Mine had been left on Mr. Malcolm's lawn, but Freddie, May, and Vicky said they still had theirs at home. Freddie's, however, likely burned up in the fire the following Christmas. His dad made the mistake of using a space heater in the garage. All of them, including Freddie, were dead the day before Christmas Eve. I refused to go trick-or-treating the next year, and everyone after that. My parents understood and didn't pressure me. Within a few years, I aged out of the tradition, but still wouldn't risk going out for a walk on Halloween night. See you next year then. And if not, the next, or the next, or the next. He waits. I know because every photo has turned out to be true. Vicky simply disappeared before her 19th birthday, and while her body was never recovered, a man suspected of torturing and killing half a dozen young women in Bridal Veil Lake, in Derry across the border, was arrested as the likely culprit. May committed suicide off the old casino hotel last July. My son is 5 now. He wants me to take him trick-or-treating in a few weeks. Of course he does. He doesn't know. Neither does my wife. That man is waiting for me. The strangest audio I've ever transcribed. I'm still trying to figure out how to start this off. I've never done this before, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form some kind of great storyteller. What I am is a woman with a fairly boring job, with the occasional burst of fucking weirdness. I work for a company that does transcriptions. Work is in quotations because technically, we're just freelancers. Honestly, I doubt any of you'll give a single, solitary fuck about the ins and outs of my job. So yeah, I'm just gonna jump to the chase here. So most days the audio we get is fairly mundane. Interviews, surveys, just random marketing or legal things people want to have transcribed for whatever reason. Sometimes we get surprisingly interesting things, like maybe a police interrogation. I've got one of those twice so far. Or once an interview between a lawyer and a potential client. I've heard of other people getting like private audio. By private I mean apparently some weird-ass motherfucker recorded himself having phone sex with someone, multiple times. Also, the audio was of the shittiest quality, so I'm glad I never got any of those. Then there are the days when something truly weird pops up. Weirder than the phone sex thing, I mean. Like spooky weird. I'd never gotten one myself, just read about them from other transcribers in our group Discord. The Discord is absolutely not company approved. The company doesn't really like us speaking with each other beyond anything work-related really, but fuck that. As I was saying though, I'd never personally gotten one of those types, just heard about them from others who had stumbled across them. I have to say, some of the audio logs people have talked about, had to listen to, left us all feeling pretty fucking unnerved. One person ended up quitting entirely after they had the supreme misfortune of taking on a particularly disturbing audio. They refused to give too much detail, claimed they were, and I quote, sparing you all from having nightmares infecting you too. The way they had worded that had left a lot of us creeped out enough and left more than a few of us worried when they fell out of contact without a word. Not just on Discord, a few of us had their socials, and there hasn't been a peep from them since that last message. A message that was left over a year ago. Back on the topic at hand though, my personal winning streak of not having to deal with any of that bullshit came to an exceptionally dramatic end a few days ago. I'll admit, in the past when I first heard about them, I was a little curious about those types of audios, in a very morbid way. Any curiosity I had usually had been its death throes after reading about an especially gruesome audio. Everything that happened with the acquaintance I mentioned earlier, that one that completely fucking vanished, yeah, any ounce of curiosity I had left was practically beaten to death with a shovel. What I'm saying is, I'd come to the conclusion that they were something I'd really rather not have to listen to. Enough of my rambling, I'm going to post a copy of the transcription below. Yes, that is insanely illegal, which is why I'm not naming the company, myself, or the Discord group. And it is very much why I abandoned the thing even after I finished. I don't think it'll be linked back to my account if someone else picks it up. They're only ever marked as previously abandoned when we pick up a dropped audio. So whoever takes credit for doing it, hopefully, shouldn't face anything. I got points docked for dropping it after the allotted grace time, but I'd rather have as little tying me to this as possible, you know? Anyway, enjoy, I guess. Transcription begins. Male interviewer. 1. I know you've been here for several hours now, Mrs. Smith, but we need you to go over this just one more time for us. It will help our investigation immensely and could potentially save lives. Are you ready? Mrs. Smith. Yeah, I guess. Why inaudible? Can I get some water or something? Male interviewer 2. That won't be possible at the moment, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith. You can't just take a moment to get me some fucking water? Male interviewer 1. I apologize, ma'am. I know you must be thirsty, but we do need to get this done as fast as possible. The sooner it's done, the sooner it can be used to aid us. I give you my word. Once we're finished, I can make sure you get some water. Mrs. Smith. Fine. Yeah, okay. So, like I said already, multiple times in fact, male interviewer 1. We do apologize for that, but it's important, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith. Right. So, right. I'd had this entire camping trip planned out for a few months now. It was going to be my sister, our cousin, and myself. At the last moment, though, inaudible, that had my sister dropping out at the last minute. So it wound up just being me and my cousin. We weren't, the closest, but we got on pretty well. Well enough that it would still be a fun trip. She was closer to my sister. Male interviewer 2. So you weren't by yourself on this trip, Mrs. Smith. I literally said my cousin was with me. It was myself and my cousin. So logically, I wasn't by myself. Male interviewer 2. I understand your frustration, ma'am, but there's no need for yelling. Please try to calm down, Mrs. Smith. Calm down. Calm down? Have you not been listening? Male interviewer 1. Mrs. Smith, my colleague misspoke. We're aware this situation has been inaudible for you, but we have to ascertain that we're understanding everything perfectly. Do you need a break? Mrs. Smith, audible sobbing. Male interviewer. 1. All right, we're going to take a short break. Audio resumes. Male interviewer. 2. Are you ready to resume, ma'am? Mrs. Smith. Yeah, yes. Okay, so, as I said earlier, it was just my cousin and I, inaudible, and it was only supposed to be a weekend thing, so we didn't bring much with us. There's this diner that she loved, and we were just going to go there for breakfast and dinner. We brought some hot dogs because, what's a camping trip without hot dogs, right? Yeah, so we left my place Friday around, I want to say noonish. We got to the campsite around 4 or so. Male interviewer 1. 4 p.m.? Mrs. Smith. Yeah, yes. 4 p.m. Male interviewer 2. Please continue. Mrs. Smith. Right, okay. South. We got to the campsite around 4, and the first thing we, inaudible, getting our tent set up. Male interviewer 1. You had separate tents? Mrs. Smith. Yeah. You saw them, right? At our campsite? They're these... Male interviewer 2. There wasn't much left of either of your tents, Mrs. Smith, which is why we needed clarification. Mrs. Smith. Oh, okay. I hadn't been back to the campsite. I didn't know. Male interviewer 1. We understand, Mrs. Smith. Inaudible. Please continue. Mrs. Smith. Okay, we had separate tents, like I said, and inaudible had taken us, my sister and I camping all the time when we were younger. So, getting them set up was easy. After that, we went to the diner for dinner. That would have, I think it was around 8. We made it back close to 10. It was dark out. Male interviewer 2. What did you do once you'd inaudible? Mrs. Smith. We started a campfire. We wanted to roast some marshmallows before going to bed. Make some s'mores. It was, at this point, the audio became severely distorted for several minutes. Before resuming, Mrs. Smith. I don't know what time it was exactly. When I checked my phone, the battery was dead. I remember thinking that was weird because, it had been a little over 50% when I went to sleep, but, yeah, it was dead. So, yeah, it's hard to say the exact time it had been. Interviewer 2. If you had to guess, though, what would you say, ma'am? Mrs. Smith. I thought you needed to be perfectly clear about everything. Isn't that what you said? Interviewer 1. We do need to be as precise as we can, Mrs. Smith. However, having the beginnings of a timeline would prove immensely helpful to us. Mrs. Smith. Right, yeah. Sorry, if I had to guess, maybe somewhere around 6? Maybe a little before that? It wasn't dawn yet, but it wasn't completely dark either. Interviewer 2. Perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Continue, please. Mrs. Smith. Yeah, sure. It was before dawn, and my cousin wasn't an early riser. She'd normally never get out of bed before 10 on the weekends, but it was hearing her that woke me up. Interviewer 1. Hearing her? What do you mean? Mrs. Smith. I heard her talking. I thought at first that inaudible, she did that sometimes, but I realized pretty fast that her voice was coming from somewhere in front of my tent. Her tent had been beside mine. Interviewer 1. I see. Could you hear what she was saying? Mrs. Smith. Not really, no. I heard the tone though. It was the same tone she used to use on stray cats and dogs when we were kids. Just, really gentle. Do you know what I mean? I heard her talking like that, and I immediately, though, she was doing something stupid like trying to pet a raccoon or something. Interviewer 2. Was that what she was doing, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. You fucking know it wasn't. You know what? Interviewer 2. Mrs. Smith, do you need to take a break? Mrs. Smith. I don't need a fucking break. I need you to stop asking me these stupid fucking questions. You know exactly what she found. I've told you and told you and told you, but you keep making me fucking repeat it, making me remember it. I got out of my tent and I saw her, and I saw that thing and inaudible. It looked like a deer. It looked like a deer, but it was so wrong, and looking at it made my skin crawl. But she was trying to help it. She thought it was sick, and she, audible sobbing. Interviewer 1. I know this is hard for you, Mrs. Smith. I understand it's incredibly unfair of us to ask you to go through this, but we have no choice. If we want to prevent this from happening again in the future, we have to ask these questions. We have to get a clear picture of what happened. Now, please, can you continue? Mrs. Smith. God, fuck, yeah, I can continue. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for... Interviewer 1. There's no need to apologize, Mrs. Smith. Your reaction is understandable, given the circumstances. Mrs. Smith. Thank you. There was a deer, and she was, crouched in front of it, really close. And she had her hand held out, and the deer was so wrong. It was so wrong. I don't understand how she could stand to look at it. I don't know what she... Inaudible. Interviewer 2. What do you mean, Mrs. Smith, when you say it was wrong? Could you elaborate, please? Mrs. Smith. Yeah, It was still a little dark out, but there was enough light to see that its face was it was really messed up. I mean, its bottom jaw was just hanging off, not like its mouth was open or broken. I mean, it was hanging off. I think the only thing keeping it attached was, oh God, skin and muscle. Just that. The deer would move its head and its jaw would sway like a fucking wind chime. Inaudible. Interviewer 1. Mrs. Smith, do you need the trash can? Mrs. Smith. No, I'm okay. Oh, Christ, yeah, I need it. Audio resumes. Mrs. Smith. God, I'm so sorry. Interviewer 1. It's fine, Mrs. Smith. You experienced something traumatic that was a perfectly normal reaction. Mrs. Smith. The only thing normal about any of this. Interviewer 2. Are you well enough to continue, ma'am? Mrs. Smith. I'm good. Inaudible was the most noticeable, but there was a lot wrong with it. The way it was standing, the way its body was angled, I could see some of its side. There was inaudible skin missing. I mean, I'm pretty sure I saw part of its fucking rib cage. Something pale, but I remember that it looked mobile. Interviewer 2. What do you mean by mobile, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. I mean, it looked like it was moving, like it was squirming almost. But that's not quite, I mean, I don't think that's the right word, but it's all I can think of to describe it. It looked wrong. I don't understand how she could have seen that thing and felt like it was safe to approach. What was it even standing? It should have been dead. It should have been dead, but it was standing there, inaudible, and she was crouching and talking, and she had her hand held out. And I saw its throat bulging. It was bulging, and it was grotesque, like something was moving and pushing, and did she see it? Did she see what it was doing? Interviewer 2. If this is anything like similar reports we've received, it's very likely she didn't, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith. What do you mean? What does that mean? Interviewer 2. Could you continue, please, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. No, I can't fucking continue. What does that mean? What the hell does that mean she didn't? How could she not? Interviewer 1. I realize this is stressful and frightening for you, Mrs. Smith, but we need you to continue, please. Mrs. Smith. Jesus fucking Christ. Fine, right. I just want to know why this happened. Interviewer 1. I give you my word, Mrs. Smith, once you finish giving this final statement, we'll make sure you understand everything. Mrs. Smith. Thank you, really. Okay. Inaudible throat was bulging, like I said. It was bulging and moving, and out of its mouth, something came out. All right, it looked like an arm, not normal. God, nothing was normal. Nothing was normal about any of it. But the arm, my cousin was maybe 2 feet away from the deer, right? 2 feet. And the arm, the fingers came out first. Out of the deer's mouth came out wiggling. And they were pale, they shone in the moonlight, and they were wet. Not from blood. It didn't look dark enough. Interviewer 2. What happened next, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. Next? Jesus fucking Christ. Next was the rest of the arm. As pale as the fingers, and it was long, and it looked segmented, but not segmented exactly. It was like too many elbows. The deer's jaw, it fell off, dropped to the ground, and the arm kept stretching towards, and she just stayed there, crouching. I was screaming then. I remember that. I was screaming at her, for her to move, to run, fucking something. But she just stayed there. I think she was still talking to the fucking thing. And oh God, it grabbed her. The arm grabbed her, and it started pulling her back with it. It was withdrawing back into the deer, and it was bringing her with it, and she never screamed. Not once. Not even when inaudible. I could hear her bones breaking, and she was being folded in half, and she never screamed. And I ran. Oh God, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I fucking ran. I left her. Interviewer 1. I know this has been difficult for you, Mrs. Smith. I appreciate your going over this with us. Would you like that water now, ma'am? Mrs. Smith. God, yes, please. I could really use some water. Male Interviewer 1. Absolutely, Mrs. Smith. Can you bring her some water to drink? I believe we're finished now. Male Interviewer 2. Of course. Male Interviewer 1. Ah, there we go. And still cold as well? I'm sure that will help. Mrs. Shiver Smith. God, yeah. I've been talking for hours and... Yeah, thank you. Male Interviewer 1. Make sure to drink it all. It will likely help you feel better. Mrs. Smith. I am, thanks. Several minutes pass at this point in silence. Mrs. Smith. I feel kind of weird, I think. Dizzy. I don't feel so good. I think I need help. Male interviewer 1. You have nothing to worry about, Mrs. Smith. That's perfectly normal. Mrs. Smith. Normal? What? Inaudible. Male interviewer 1. I gave you my word you'd learn what happened. Your statements have been taken, your cooperation noted, and I believe now it's time you found out. Thanks for tuning in to today's horror story. If you have a horror, mystery, or haunting story you'd like to share, send it to us at Urban America Horror, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here waiting for your next horror story.